I'm from Massachusetts, and we're playing. No, we're reacting to Alien Biosphere's Part 2, biblaridon. I still can't pronounce the name. Early life and the body plans.
Last time, Artifexian helped me create an alien planet, as well as its star, moon, orbital characteristics, atmosphere, and tectonics. Now that we know all the abiotic factors present on this planet, we can begin creating some life forms to inhabit it. There are many methods for going about doing this, but here we're going to start right at the beginning of the planet's history and evolve an entire biosphere. Of course, creating a fully fleshed out biosphere is a massive undertaking, so this will just serve as a pretty broad overview on how the principles of evolution can be used to design scientifically feasible alien life forms. So then, let's get to work. After the planet consolidates and the oceans form, the world remains a fairly quiet place for quite a while. At some point within the first billion years of the planet's existence, life arises deep within the ocean. The exact
And yes, I'm up. Making these videos in the same day. That's why I'm still eating.
mechanism of how life comes about is still not fully understood, but as it proliferates, it begins to affect many aspects of the planet itself. In the history of Earth, the earliest organisms were most likely heterotrophic, meaning they were incapable of producing their own energy and thus had to take up nutrients from the environment. That is, they had to eat things. However, at some point very soon after life first appeared, an evolutionary innovation occurred in which some early groups of microbes evolved the ability to use inorganic molecules to power chemical processes from which they derived their energy. Organisms capable of doing this are called autotrophs, and include phototrophs, like plants and cyanobacteria, which use sunlight to power their metabolism, as well as chemotrophs, like extremophile bacteria that gain energy from geochemically produced sulfides. These autotrophic mechanisms seem to have arisen numerous times in unrelated lineages, so it's likely that autotrophy will evolve in some of the primitive microbes on our alien planet as well. Photosynthetic organisms may evolve to use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars and oxygen, but also, thanks to the high proportion of hydrogen sulfide in the atmosphere, sulfur-oxidizing chemotrophs may thrive as well. Whereas on Earth, these chemotrophs are restricted to areas like geothermal vents, on our alien planet they may also flourish in surface waters. Additionally, hydrogen sulfide dissolves in water, which will cause the oceans to acidify, so these early life forms will likely have some means of tolerating the acid, much like acidophile bacteria on Earth. As these autotrophs proliferate, they'll start to change the composition of the atmosphere, as the phototrophs convert the carbon dioxide into oxygen, and the chemotrophs turn the hydrogen sulfide into elemental sulfur. And as atmospheric oxygen increases, it has a profound effect on the development of life. Oxygen is highly reactive, which makes it great for powering biochemistry. This results in the evolution of aerobic respiration, in some ways the counterpart of photosynthesis, taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. While other forms of respiration do exist, aerobic respiration is almost always the most efficient form. Once aerobic respiration evolves, we'll soon get complex colonial and eventually multicellular organisms, until eventually we come to a critical point in the planet's natural history. For most of its existence, life on Earth mainly comprised simple, soft-bodied creatures, with evolutionary changes taking place very gradually over vast stretches of time. But then, about 4 billion years into the Earth's lifetime, there was suddenly a huge burst of biodiversity called the Cambrian explosion, wherein the ancestors of virtually every modern animal body plan appear in the fossil record, all within a span of only about 25 million years, which is pretty negligible in the timescale of natural history. While there were certainly many factors at play here, one element that may have contributed to this event was the evolution of predation. Before this point, an organism could get away with just blindly floating about at the mercy of the ocean currents, passively obtaining oxygen and nutrients from the water. There's no real need to deviate from this lifestyle, so there's no real pressure to evolve anything new. But with the advent of active predators, you're not going to last very long if you don't have some form of defense mechanism. This leads to the evolution of the first armor, the first defensive behaviors, and the first eyes. And this then puts an impetus on the predators to evolve some way around their prey's defenses, and this arms race then escalates, dramatically increasing the rate at which life diversifies. It's quite likely that the appearance of predators will trigger an analog to the Cambrian explosion on our alien planet. So we'll say that around the 4 billion year mark, our previously simple, soft-bodied ecosystems will suddenly diversify into a huge number of new phyla. While difficult to define precisely, a phylum is a lineage of life forms in possession of a shared or related body plan. For example, insects, arachnids, myriapods, and crustaceans all belong to the phylum Arthropoda, meaning they all evolved from a single common ancestor whose body plan they adapted in various ways. So our first step is to design some basic body plans. These don't need to be perfect, or even necessarily representative of any one species. What we're looking for here is a rough blueprint that serves as an outline for our physiology and lifestyle. While there's a lot of scope for variation, we can figure out what makes for a functional body plan by looking at some of the trends in phyla that exist on Earth. Let's compare a typical vertebrate body plan, like that of a dog, with a typical arthropod body plan, like that of an ant. Now, superficially, these two animals may seem quite different, but they also show some pretty striking similarities. They both have a symmetrical body with limbs used for locomotion, a distinct head that contains a brain and bears the sensory organs and the mouth, and a body containing internal organ systems, such as a heart that pumps oxygen-rich blood around the body, and a digestive tract that runs from one end of the animal to the other. All of these characteristics are especially remarkable, considering the last common ancestor of these two animals looked something like this. This means that all of the above traits independently within these two body plans, suggesting that such characteristics readily arise in unrelated groups in response to similar evolutionary pressures, what's known as convergent evolution. And if these traits can evolve multiple times on Earth, then why not on an alien planet as well? Now, this doesn't mean that all body plans have to be built along these lines, but it recalls one of my personal world-building mottos: know the rules before you break the rules. In other words, make sure you understand why something is the way it is in the real world before changing it in a fictional world. So then, why is it beneficial to have these traits? To find out, let's create some sample body plans step by step and see what characteristics emerge. To start off, complex multicellular animals most often exhibit some form of symmetry. Some animals, like starfish, anemones, and jellyfish, exhibit radial symmetry, in which the body is arranged in a circle around a central axis, while other animals, like mollusks, arthropods, and vertebrates, demonstrate bilateral symmetry, where the two sides of the body are mirror images of each other. Pacing back and forth. I don't understand why. Let's create two body plans, one with radial symmetry and the other with bilateral symmetry. This already has some implications for these animals' biology. On Earth, most radially symmetrical creatures tend to be slow-moving, largely immobile, or sometimes completely sessile, while many animals that are bilaterally symmetrical display a high degree of mobility. Now, it could be that radial phyla on Earth just happen to have never evolved to become very motile, or it could be that having bilateral symmetry is advantageous for a motile lifestyle. We'll touch more on this later, but for now, let's play it safe and make our radially symmetrical plan sessile, and our bilaterally symmetrical one motile. Sessile animals have the difficult task of acquiring oxygen and nutrients without moving, relying on the ocean currents to bring food and oxygen to them. These animals will typically have a surface through which they can absorb oxygen from the surrounding water, which may double as a means of catching plankton or other food particles. Obviously, the larger this surface is, the more food and oxygen the animal can obtain. However, if we enlarge the surface by simply scaling the creature up in size, we run into a problem. The larger something is, the greater its volume becomes relative to its surface area, which means that as our radial life form gets larger, the smaller its feeding surface becomes in proportion to its increasingly large body, lowering overall feeding efficiency. This relationship between surface area and volume is known as the square cube law, and it's a fundamental principle that has numerous ramifications for how life evolves. And keep it in mind because we're going to be referencing it a lot throughout this series. Our radial body plan will therefore need maximum surface area while minimizing volume. This favors a flat, leaf-like, or perhaps feather-like structure, much like sea pens and sea fans on Earth. And since this creature has radial symmetry, perhaps it has a circle of these structures in a flower-like arrangement. Meanwhile, our bilateral body plan presents a different set of parameters. It will also need some method of gaining oxygen from the water, but if it's an active, motile animal, having a large feathery surface for gas exchange would increase drag, making swimming less efficient. This means its gills need to have maximum surface area while also being hydrodynamically optimal. This may favor a long and thin body with gills running down the sides. One innovation that might come in handy here is segmentation or serial repetition, the dividing of a body plan into a series of identical or near-identical units. Perhaps the most obvious real-world examples being arthropods and annelids, but technically, even vertebrates can be considered segmented, for reasons that we'll get into later. For now, let's say our bilaterian has 9 segments, with each segment possessing a pair of limbs and a gill surface. Perhaps it swims with back and forth strokes of its paddle-like limbs, which will have the added benefit of encouraging water over the gills and increasing oxygen intake. Being motile requires a lot more energy than being sessile, so this animal will need an efficient way of transporting this oxygen around the body, and this may come in the form of blood. Blood has evolved as a means of transporting oxygen and nutrients in many different animal groups on Earth, and comes in a variety of chemical variants. However, many blood-bearing animals don't contain blood in arteries and veins, but rather use what's called an open circulatory system, in which the internal organs are surrounded by a blood-filled cavity or hemocoel. This isn't quite as efficient as a closed circulatory system like those found in vertebrates and cephalopods, where the network of blood vessels creates a continuous supply of oxygen to all parts of the body. One way to make the system more efficient is to have a muscle or pump to ensure a constant flow of oxygen-rich blood over the organs and of oxygen-depleted blood back to the gill surface. Perhaps our bilaterian has a series of muscular rings around the hemocoel, like a collection of primitive hearts, which will give the animal an efficient means of powering its metabolism. So that takes care of oxygen, but this creature will also need a means of acquiring food. Since this is a motile animal, it will be able to move to new areas to actively seek out food, allowing it to potentially adopt a predatory lifestyle. So it will need a mouth to consume prey and a digestive tract to allow the nutrients from the ingested food to diffuse into the blood and be transported around the body. Now, since we're dealing with an active motile animal, and because it's bilaterally symmetrical, that necessarily means that the creature has a front and a back end. This pretty much inevitably leads to another very common evolutionary trend, cephalization, the clustering together of the nervous system into a head of sorts, which frequently co-occurs with the sensory organs and the mouth. While cephalization does occur to a limited degree among radial body plans, it tends to be a lot more pronounced in bilateral creatures, for the simple reason that it helps to have the sensory organs arranged so that you can see what's in front of you, and to have a mouth near the sensory organs to make it easier to eat things, and so that you can sense the food before it's ingested. So first off, we're going to need to give our creature some form of sensory organ, in particular, eyes. Somewhat surprisingly, eyes seem to evolve quite easily, as evidenced by the fact that they've arisen independently many times across hugely disparate lineages, with even some microbes and seaweeds being able to sense light to some degree. What begins as a patch of light-sensitive cells may then form into a sort of cup that allows the animal to better sense the direction that light is coming from, and then a lens may evolve to focus the light directly onto the retina to resolve a clear image. Most often, animals will have at least 2 eyes, since having multiple eyes allows for increased depth perception. This can range from the only 2 eyes of vertebrates, to the 3 to 8 eyes of arthropods, to the 24 eyes of the box jellyfish, to the over 100 eyes of scallops. We'll give our bilaterian an array of 6 simple eyes surrounding the mouth, giving it a full view of what's in front of it. And once it has the ability to see, the animal will need a way of processing the sensory information. While nerves run the full length of the body, perhaps a ganglion or nerve cluster evolves near the eyes, like a primitive brain. And so now we have something like a head taking shape. Meanwhile, in radially symmetrical body plans, cephalization may involve grouping the nervous system around the center of mass, like the nerve net of a jellyfish or the nerve ring of a starfish. A sessile organism doesn't have very many intellectually demanding tasks to attend to, so it can afford to have a comparatively simple nervous system. However, if our radial creatures are feeding using a large, delicate membrane, that makes them very vulnerable to predators, so they may benefit from an early warning system. Perhaps they have vibration-sensitive cells or even simple eyes near the tips of their feeding appendages that allow them to detect incoming predators. But having the ability to sense predators does little good if there's no way to respond to it. Since swimming away isn't an option, many sessile animals have some form of armor for protection. On Earth, the shells of these marine creatures are usually calcareous, most often calcium carbonate. But here, we have the opportunity to do something a little bit different. Remember that we've got an atmosphere rich in hydrogen sulfide, which dissolves in water, and we've got chemosynthetic microbes that convert atmospheric hydrogen sulfide into elemental sulfur. This means that there's an enormous amount of free sulfur available, so maybe the marine organisms can evolve to take up the sulfur to form hard shells made out of calcium sulfate. So our radial body plan can have a protective shell into which it can retract its feeding arms. Motile animals, on the other hand, have the advantage of swimming away to avoid predators, so our bilateral body plan may forego armor completely and instead invest purely in speed. Now, both of our body plans have a means of respiration, feeding, and defense. But there's still one last essential detail to figure out: reproduction. The most basic means of reproduction is asexual reproduction, where an organism reproduces by essentially cloning itself, creating offspring that are, for all intents and purposes, genetically identical to the parent. Since doing this doesn't require a mate, the organism isn't limited in its spawning and can reproduce whenever it wants, allowing populations to multiply very quickly. However, despite these advantages, asexual reproduction isn't actually as common as you might think. There appears to be a strong evolutionary pressure across just about every branch of the tree of life to maximize genetic diversity, which allows for beneficial genes to spread quickly through populations and accelerates the rate of adaptation. Because of this, sexual reproduction has become the most common reproductive strategy across virtually every lineage of multicellular life. Even many kinds of bacteria have some mechanism for exchanging genes. Sexual reproduction most often involves a distinction between male and female sexes, but there's a huge number of possible variants on this system, and we'll discuss those at a later date. For now, let's say that both our radial and our bilateral body plans have individuals that are either male or female. When it comes to sexual reproduction, sessile organisms face a problem. How do you find a mate if you can't move? The most common solution to this is what's called broadcast spawning, where the animals release an enormous quantity of gametes, or sex cells, into the water. Only a tiny fraction of male and female cells will meet and develop into larvae, and only a small portion of those larvae will survive to adulthood. This is a very inefficient strategy, but it's one of the only reliable ways for sessile organisms to ensure a high degree of dispersal. Often, the larvae of these sessile creatures evolve adaptations to help them cope with this first incredibly vulnerable period of their life cycle. For our radial creatures, before the larvae have grown to the point where they can attach themselves to the seabed and develop their protective armor, they'll need to rely on some other defense mechanism. Perhaps they can adapt their underdeveloped feeding arms into appendages they can beat back and forth for locomotion, allowing them some degree of motility to escape predators and find a suitable spot to metamorphose into adults. For our bilateral creature, being motile allows it to actively search for a mate, which massively increases the chances of a successful fertilization. Let's give it a gonopore, or gland that produces gametes, on its final segment. And there we have it, 2 basic body plans. Depending on how detailed your project is, a full biosphere will have anywhere from half a dozen to over 100 body plans, but for this series, we'll just focus on these 2. I'm going to dub the radial phylum Anthostoma, and the bilateral one Polypodia. Note that I'm using standard Greek and Latin-based nomenclature, but feel free to use whatever naming schema makes sense for your project. Now, these body plans may not seem all that different from some of the ones that exist on Earth, but I've done this intentionally to demonstrate why certain real-world body plans have evolved the way they have. For your own project, feel free to run wild with ideas and create whatever off-the-wall body plans you can come up with, as long as they have a justifiable means of respiration, feeding, defense, and reproduction. However, remember that these body plans are just basic ancestral blueprints, and as they evolve over the next few 100 million years, they may become completely unrecognizable from these primitive forebears. In the next episode, we'll see how the descendants of these ancient creatures diversify into a whole menagerie of different forms.
So see you guys in the next episode of reacting to this channel.